If a king is willing to lose a crown for one person, then the kingdom has already changed forever. No one expected history to pause because of a single touch, yet that was exactly what happened on the morning the Grand Hall of Ashford Palace welcomed the rulers of 4 nations for the most important peace summit in a generation. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while banners from every allied kingdom hung proudly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Diplomats rehearsed polite smiles, royal advisors whispered over final documents, and musicians filled the air with elegant melodies that promised a future without conflict. At the center of it all stood Ethan Brooks, a young Omega assigned as a junior diplomatic secretary, carefully organizing treaty folders that would soon carry the signatures of kings. Ethan had never wanted attention. His quiet professionalism and calm voice made him nearly invisible among nobles born into privilege, and he preferred it that way. Across the room, seated upon the elevated throne reserved for ceremonial occasions, King Alexander Ashford watched every movement with unreadable blue eyes. His reputation had been forged through wisdom rather than fear. Leaders respected him because he always chose restraint over pride, logic over impulse. If anyone could preserve peace between rival kingdoms, it was Alexander. At precisely 10 o'clock, the northern delegation entered the hall led by Damien Blackwood, the alpha ruler whose charm was nearly as famous as his confidence. He greeted ambassadors with effortless warmth before turning his attention toward Ethan, who stepped forward to offer the official treaty portfolio. Damien smiled politely, thanked him, and as he accepted the leather case, his fingertips brushed lightly against Ethan's hand for only an instant. It was the kind of accidental contact that normally passed unnoticed. Instead, every sound inside the Grand Hall disappeared. Alexander rose from his throne before anyone understood why. His voice echoed across the chamber with calm authority that somehow felt louder than any shout. "Touch my Omega again," he declared, never taking his eyes off Damien, "and no throne will survive this war." Silence swallowed the room. Pens stopped moving. Advisors froze. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. The words seemed impossible. Ethan stared in disbelief, certain he had misunderstood what he had just heard. His Omega? The king had never spoken to him outside official duties. They had exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. Confused whispers spread among the gathered nobles. Some believed Alexander had revealed a secret engagement. Others suspected an elaborate political strategy hidden beneath the shocking declaration. Damien remained perfectly composed, though surprise flickered briefly across his face before fading into a curious smile. Instead of responding with anger, he simply inclined his head and stepped back. The treaty remained unsigned. The celebration transformed into uncertainty within seconds. Every alliance suddenly felt fragile. Every conversation carried new meaning. Ethan could feel dozens of eyes following him, searching for answers he did not possess. As Alexander slowly descended from the royal platform, he stopped beside Ethan without looking directly at him. In a voice only Ethan could hear, he quietly said, "Stay close to me today. There are truths you were never meant to discover this way." Before Ethan could ask what those words meant, the massive palace doors opened once again, and an elderly royal historian rushed inside holding an ancient family record that had supposedly been lost for hundreds of years. His trembling expression suggested that the king's astonishing declaration was only the beginning of a far greater secret. The Grand Hall did not return to normal after the historian arrived. Instead, every conversation became quieter, every glance lingered a little longer, and every smile seemed carefully rehearsed. King Alexander dismissed the formal signing ceremony until further notice, explaining that unexpected historical records required immediate verification before any international agreement could continue. His explanation sounded reasonable enough for diplomats to accept, yet everyone knew the official statement concealed something far more significant. Ethan followed the king through the eastern corridor toward a private council chamber, struggling to understand why his ordinary life had suddenly become the center of royal attention. Just that morning, he had expected to spend the day organizing documents and serving tea during negotiations. Now nobles stepped aside whenever he walked past, servants bowed more deeply than before, and palace guards silently repositioned themselves to accompany him. None of it made sense. Inside the council chamber, the elderly historian carefully placed an aged leather journal upon the polished oak table. Its faded cover carried the royal crest from a dynasty that had disappeared nearly 2 centuries earlier. The old man adjusted his glasses before speaking with obvious caution. "Your Majesty, this record was discovered behind a sealed archive wall during restoration work last month. We believed it contained routine genealogy, but after hearing your declaration today, I recognized a family mark that appears nowhere else in the kingdom." Alexander nodded without interrupting. Ethan remained standing near the doorway, uncertain whether he even belonged in the room. The historian slowly opened the journal to reveal a hand-drawn family tree surrounded by handwritten notes that had survived generations. One branch ended with a symbol identical to the silver pendant Ethan had worn since childhood. Instinctively, he reached beneath his shirt and pulled the small pendant into view. The old historian inhaled sharply. "That is impossible," he whispered. Ethan frowned. "My parents gave me this before they passed away. They always said it was only a family keepsake." The historian gently shook his head. "No. It is a royal lineage seal. Every legitimate heir carried one before the dynasty vanished." Ethan looked toward Alexander, expecting surprise, but the king showed none. Instead, Alexander appeared quietly resigned, as though he had been waiting for confirmation rather than discovery. "You already suspected this," Ethan said. Alexander finally met his eyes. "I suspected there was more to your history than anyone realized. I did not have proof until today." Before Ethan could ask another question, a palace attendant entered and respectfully bowed. "Your Majesty, Lord Damien has requested a private audience before returning to the northern residence." Alexander considered the request for only a moment. "Grant it." Minutes later, Damien entered the chamber with the same calm confidence he had displayed earlier. He acknowledged the historian before turning his attention toward Ethan. "I hope my accidental mistake did not cause unnecessary discomfort," he said with genuine politeness. Ethan offered a small nod. "It was unexpected for everyone." Damien smiled slightly. "Especially for me." Alexander remained silent, carefully observing every word exchanged between them. Damien noticed the journal resting open on the table but made no attempt to examine it. Instead, he addressed the king directly. "Your Majesty, whatever secret has surfaced today, I assure you the Northern Kingdom has no desire to interfere." His words sounded sincere, yet something about the timing felt deliberate. As Damien prepared to leave, he paused beside Ethan and quietly added, "Be careful. When forgotten names return to history, powerful people begin rewriting the future." He walked away before Ethan could respond. After the chamber door closed, Alexander crossed the room and locked the ancient journal inside a carved cabinet secured with an iron key. "From this moment forward," he said, "your daily schedule changes. You will no longer work alone, you will not leave palace grounds without an escort, and every visitor will require my approval." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "I am still the same person I was yesterday." Alexander's expression softened for the first time that day. "That is exactly what worries me. Everyone else is about to see someone completely different, and once they do, there will be no returning to the life you thought was yours." By sunrise the following morning, the atmosphere inside Ashford Palace had changed completely. The palace still appeared elegant from the outside, with its white stone walls glowing beneath the early light, but beneath the calm routine every corridor carried an invisible sense of urgency. Guards who normally stood only at entrances were now positioned outside libraries, gardens, and even the private offices used by royal staff. Ethan noticed the difference immediately as he left his temporary guest suite under the escort Alexander had assigned to him. Every servant greeted him with unusual respect, while several council members quietly stopped their conversations the moment he passed. He wanted nothing more than to disappear into the ordinary routine he had known only a day earlier, but ordinary no longer existed. Alexander had ordered breakfast to be served in a private sunroom overlooking the eastern gardens rather than the public dining hall. It was the first opportunity Ethan had to speak freely. "You still have not explained why everyone suddenly believes I matter," Ethan said as he looked across the table. Alexander folded the morning reports before answering. Because information spreads faster than any messenger. Yesterday only a few people knew about the journal. Today every noble family in the capital has already heard rumors that a forgotten bloodline may have returned. Ethan sighed. Rumors are not facts. That has never stopped kingdoms from making dangerous decisions, Alexander replied calmly. Before Ethan could continue, the palace steward entered carrying 3 sealed letters marked with the crests of neighboring kingdoms. Alexander opened the first message without expression. The second caused him to pause briefly. By the third, his face became unreadable. Ethan watched in silence. What do they want? Alexander placed the letters side by side. Meetings. Ethan frowned. All of them? Every one. The requests had arrived from 3 different rulers who had not communicated with Ashford in months. Each politely asked for an audience to discuss future diplomatic cooperation. None of the letters mentioned Ethan by name, yet every request had been written within hours of the interrupted peace summit. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, Alexander allowed Ethan to visit the royal archives under heavy escort, hoping that learning more about his family history might answer at least some of the growing questions. Endless shelves stretched across the enormous chamber, filled with handwritten records dating back centuries. The elderly historian patiently guided Ethan through faded maps, portraits, and royal family registers. Most of the names meant nothing to him until they reached a painting covered by a protective cloth. The historian carefully uncovered the canvas, revealing the portrait of a young royal advisor who had lived nearly 200 years earlier. Ethan froze. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same gentle eyes. The same light brown hair. Even the silver pendant resting around the painted figure's neck matched the one Ethan wore. His name was Elias Brooks, the historian explained quietly. He disappeared during the final days of the old dynasty. Official records claimed the family line ended forever. Ethan stared at the painting, unable to look away. He looks exactly like me. That is why I believe history has preserved more than stories. Footsteps echoed from the entrance of the archive hall. Alexander arrived accompanied by his chief advisor, but neither appeared relieved. Instead, the advisor handed the king another sealed report. Alexander read only a few lines before folding it closed. "We have a problem," he said. Ethan immediately recognized the seriousness in his voice. "What happened?" Alexander looked toward the historian before answering. "The Northern Kingdom has requested permission to study every surviving document connected to the lost royal family." Ethan felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sunlight filling the archive windows. Damien promised he would not interfere. Perhaps he believed that when he said it, Alexander answered. Or perhaps someone else is making decisions beyond his knowledge. At that exact moment, another palace messenger hurried into the archive carrying urgent news from the Western Watchtower. An unfamiliar delegation had arrived without prior notice, claiming they carried evidence concerning Ethan Brooks and insisting that the truth hidden inside Ashford Palace belonged not to one kingdom, but to the entire continent. The unexpected delegation entered Ashford Palace just before sunset, escorted through the outer courtyard by royal guards who remained respectful but alert. Their banners displayed no kingdom's crest, only a silver compass surrounded by 12 stars, the ancient emblem of the Continental Council, an organization that had not publicly intervened in royal affairs for generations. Palace officials exchanged uneasy glances as 6 delegates crossed the marble floor with measured confidence, led by an elderly woman whose calm expression suggested she had anticipated this meeting long before anyone else. Ethan stood beside Alexander at the end of the audience chamber, still struggling to understand why strangers from distant lands suddenly seemed interested in his existence. The council leader offered a respectful bow before speaking. "Your Majesty, we appreciate your hospitality. We have not come to challenge your authority. We have come because history is repeating itself." Alexander answered with steady composure. "Then explain why your council believes my palace concerns the entire continent." Without hesitation, the woman presented a sealed wooden case bearing layers of faded wax. Inside are copies of agreements signed 193 years ago by every reigning kingdom. They were never meant to be opened unless the lost bloodline returned. The chamber fell silent once again. Ethan looked toward Alexander, but even the king appeared surprised by the statement. The case was carefully opened, revealing several remarkably preserved documents. The council leader selected the oldest page and slowly read aloud. It described an alliance formed after the collapse of the previous dynasty, declaring that if a legitimate heir ever reappeared, every sovereign nation would gather to determine the future together rather than allowing one kingdom to claim exclusive authority. Ethan felt overwhelmed. "I have never ruled anything," he said quietly. "I spent my life believing I was an ordinary citizen." The woman nodded kindly. "That may be true. Yet history often recognizes people before they recognize themselves." One of Alexander's advisors stepped forward. "These agreements are nearly 2 centuries old. Why would anyone still honor them?" The council leader answered without hesitation. "Because every royal family preserved a copy. Some treated them as legend. Others waited patiently." Before anyone could continue, another attendant hurried into the chamber carrying fresh correspondence that had arrived only minutes earlier. Alexander accepted the envelope and read the message in silence. He slowly looked up. "The Eastern Kingdom has requested immediate negotiations." Moments later, a second attendant entered with another letter. Then a third. Within half an hour, invitations had arrived from every neighboring nation. None declared hostility. None issued demands. Every ruler simply wished to meet Ethan Brooks in person. The realization settled over the room with unmistakable weight. Ethan was no longer merely the subject of palace rumors. He had become the center of continental diplomacy. That evening, Alexander invited Ethan onto a quiet balcony overlooking the illuminated capital. Thousands of lanterns glowed below while the distant bells of the city echoed through the cool night air. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Finally Ethan broke the silence. "Do you believe all of this? Do you truly think I belong to that forgotten family?" Alexander rested his hands against the stone railing before answering. "I believe your character matters more than your ancestry. But I also know the world rarely makes that distinction." Ethan looked across the city where ordinary families continued their evening routines, completely unaware that political history might be changing above them. "I never asked for any of this." Alexander nodded. "Neither did many great leaders." Ethan shook his head with a faint smile. "I am not a leader." Alexander answered gently. "Perhaps not yet." Before Ethan could respond, footsteps approached from behind. Damien Blackwood appeared at the balcony entrance after receiving permission to visit privately before departing the capital. His expression carried none of the confidence Ethan had first noticed during the peace summit. Instead, it reflected genuine concern. "I have just received reports from my own advisors," Damien said. "They confirmed the Continental Council activated every surviving treaty the moment your identity became credible." Ethan looked from Damien to Alexander. "So every kingdom truly intends to come here?" Damien slowly nodded. "No. They intend to compete." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "Compete for what?" Damien held Ethan's gaze before quietly replying, "Not for a throne. For the future that only one person may now have the power to shape." Morning arrived beneath heavy grey clouds, and Ashford Palace awakened to the sound of arriving carriages instead of celebration bells. Representatives from neighboring kingdoms filled the royal courtyard, each carrying gifts, historical records, and carefully prepared proposals that all shared the same hidden purpose. Every nation wanted a place at the table before the future of the continent was decided. Ethan watched the arrivals from the library window, unable to believe that strangers had traveled hundreds of miles because of a name he had only learned about days earlier. Alexander joined him without speaking at first. Together they observed the endless procession of diplomats climbing the palace steps. Finally Ethan broke the silence. "Do they truly believe I can change the future?" Alexander answered honestly. "They believe your existence could change the balance between every kingdom. Sometimes people fear possibilities more than realities. Before another word could be exchanged, the palace steward announced that the royal council had assembled in the grand chamber and requested the king's immediate presence. Alexander glanced toward Ethan before quietly saying, "Remain here until I return." Ethan nodded, though uncertainty continued to grow inside him. The royal council had advised Ashford kings for generations, and its members represented the most influential families in the kingdom. As Alexander entered the circular council chamber, 12 advisors rose from their seats. None smiled. At the center of the polished table rested a single parchment bearing the royal seal. Chancellor William Hawthorne, the oldest member of the council, spoke first. "Your Majesty, the situation has developed beyond ordinary diplomacy. Neighboring kingdoms now believe Ashford intends to secure exclusive influence over the restored bloodline." Alexander remained standing. "Ashford intends to protect one innocent citizen." The Chancellor slowly shook his head. "The continent will not see innocence. They will only see opportunity." Another council member leaned forward. "We have reviewed every possible outcome. There is only one solution capable of preserving stability." The Chancellor carefully turned the parchment toward the king. "You must publicly surrender your personal guardianship of Ethan Brooks and allow the Continental Council to assume responsibility." Alexander's expression did not change. "No." Silence settled across the chamber. The Chancellor continued patiently. "If you refuse, every kingdom will believe your judgment is compromised by personal attachment." Alexander answered without hesitation. "Their opinion does not determine my duty." Another advisor spoke with visible concern. "Then consider your throne. Trade agreements may collapse. Military alliances could dissolve. Even longtime allies may withdraw support." Alexander looked around the room at the men and women who had served beside him for years. If protecting one person costs political influence, then influence was never worth protecting. The Chancellor sighed before revealing the final page beneath the first document. "Then there is another option." Alexander lowered his eyes toward the second parchment. It contained a formal declaration prepared under an ancient constitutional clause. If signed, Alexander would voluntarily transfer executive authority to a temporary regent until the continental dispute ended. The kingdom would remain stable, but he would no longer rule. "You prepared this before speaking with me," Alexander observed quietly. "We prepared for every possibility," the Chancellor admitted. "Please understand, Your Majesty, this recommendation is not punishment. It is sacrifice for the greater good." Alexander remained silent for several long moments before lifting the pen placed beside the document. Every council member watched without breathing. Instead of signing, Alexander gently laid the pen back upon the table. "I became king to protect the people entrusted to this crown," he said. "If I abandon one innocent person because protecting him has become inconvenient, then I would already have surrendered everything this throne represents." Without another word, he folded the unsigned declaration and placed it back before the council. When Alexander returned to the library, Ethan immediately recognized that something important had happened. "They asked you to choose," Ethan said softly. Alexander looked surprised. "How did you know?" Ethan offered a faint, uneasy smile. "Because everyone keeps looking at me as though I have become a problem they cannot solve." Alexander stepped closer. "You are not the problem." Before Ethan could answer, the palace bells rang 3 times, the signal reserved for extraordinary royal announcements. A messenger hurried into the library carrying a sealed decree from the Continental Council. With trembling hands he presented it to the king. Alexander opened the document and read only the first sentence before quietly closing his eyes. Ethan felt his heart sink. "What does it say?" Alexander looked directly at him and answered with complete honesty. "The council has summoned every ruler on the continent to Ashford Palace. In 7 days, they intend to decide your future before the entire world." The announcement spread across the capital before noon. Within hours every inn, marketplace, and government office buzzed with the same unbelievable news. In 7 days, the rulers of the continent would gather inside Ashford Palace to determine the future of a man who, only a week earlier, had been an unknown diplomatic secretary. Ethan struggled to accept that reality as he stood in the palace conservatory surrounded by towering glass walls and rows of blooming white orchids. It had always been his favorite place because no one expected conversations there. Today, however, even the flowers seemed unable to silence the weight pressing against his thoughts. Alexander found him standing beside the central fountain. "You should have someone with you," the king said gently. Ethan gave a tired smile. "That is becoming difficult. Everywhere I go, someone follows." Alexander nodded with quiet understanding. "That is because everyone believes your safety now affects the future of every kingdom." Ethan looked toward the flowing water. "I do not want kingdoms depending on me. I only wanted a simple life." Alexander answered without hesitation. "The life you wanted still matters. I have not forgotten that." Before Ethan could respond, footsteps echoed through the conservatory. Damien Blackwood approached alone, having requested permission for a private conversation under the protection of diplomatic custom. Alexander remained cautious but allowed him to enter. Damien stopped several feet away and spoke with unusual seriousness. "I came because something does not feel right." Alexander folded his arms. "Explain." Damien glanced toward Ethan before continuing. 3 separate delegations arrived in my capital yesterday asking detailed questions about his childhood, his education, and every place he has ever lived. None represented official governments. Someone is gathering information outside normal diplomatic channels. Ethan frowned. "Who would do that?" Damien slowly shook his head. "I do not know, but whoever they are moving much faster than the kingdoms themselves." Alexander considered the warning carefully. "Thank you for bringing this directly to us." Damien gave a respectful nod. "Whether we agree politically or not, uncertainty benefits no one." As Damien departed, Alexander quietly ordered palace security to review every visitor record from the previous month. By evening, the captain of the Royal Guard returned with troubling news. Several individuals using false identities had entered the capital during recent weeks, each claiming different professions but all disappearing before routine verification could be completed. None had committed crimes. None had left obvious evidence. Yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Ethan listened as the captain finished his report. "Do you think they were searching for me?" he asked. The captain answered honestly. "We cannot prove it, but the timing is difficult to dismiss." Alexander immediately ordered security to be increased throughout the palace. Guest access was restricted, servant schedules were reviewed, and every entrance remained under continuous observation. The precautions reassured the royal staff, but they made Ethan feel more isolated than protected. Late that evening, unable to sleep, Ethan quietly stepped onto a moonlit terrace connected to his private chambers. The palace gardens below appeared peaceful beneath rows of glowing lanterns, and for the first time all day he allowed himself a deep breath. He had barely reached the stone railing when he noticed a folded envelope resting upon it. There was no seal, no name, and no indication of who had left it behind. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. "If you wish to learn why your family disappeared, come to the old observatory before sunrise. Come alone." Ethan stared at the message, uncertain whether it was a warning or a trap. Before he could decide what to do, Alexander stepped quietly onto the terrace behind him. Ethan instinctively turned the paper over, but Alexander had already noticed the movement. "What is it?" the king asked. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before handing him the note. Alexander read it carefully without changing expression. When he finished, he folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. "You are not going," he said firmly. Ethan looked at him. "What if whoever wrote it knows the truth about my family?" Alexander answered with calm certainty. "Then we will find the truth another way." Before either of them could continue, a palace guard hurried onto the terrace, clearly out of breath. "Your Majesty," he reported, "the old observatory has already been searched." Alexander immediately looked up. And? The guard swallowed hard before answering. Someone was there before us. They left only one thing behind. He held out a weathered silver pendant identical to the one Ethan had worn around his neck since childhood, except this second pendant had been deliberately separated into two matching halves, as though it had been waiting years for the missing piece to finally return. The discovery of the second pendant transformed quiet suspicion into determined investigation. Before sunrise, Alexander gathered only the people he trusted completely inside a secure chamber. Beneath the palace library, Ethan sat beside the long oak table while Damien accepted an invitation to remain despite representing another kingdom. The elderly historian carefully examined both pendants under the light of an oil lamp before gently fitting the broken edges together. The pieces aligned perfectly, revealing a complete crest hidden across both halves. Around the restored symbol appeared a circle of tiny engraved words that had been impossible to read before. The historian adjusted his glasses and slowly translated the ancient inscription. When the circle is restored, the keeper of memory shall reveal the forgotten promise. Silence settled over the room. Ethan looked at the completed pendant with growing curiosity. What does that mean? The historian sighed thoughtfully. It suggests the pendant was never intended to be worn as jewelry alone. It was designed to guide someone toward a hidden record. Alexander leaned forward. A record kept where? Before the historian could answer, Damien reached into his travel case and unfolded a weathered map he had brought from the Northern Archives. My scholars found this after I returned home, he explained. At first it appeared unrelated, but now I believe it belongs with your discovery. He placed the map beside the pendant. In its center stood an illustration of the original Royal Observatory, connected by faded lines to several forgotten landmarks surrounding the capital. One location had been marked with the same completed crest now visible on the restored pendant. Ethan recognized the place immediately. That is St. Rowan Chapel, he said quietly. It has been closed for years. The historian nodded. According to old records, the final royal archivist disappeared there shortly before the dynasty collapsed. Alexander immediately ordered a discreet visit before dawn could expose their plans. Rather than sending soldiers, the small group traveled in plain clothing through quiet streets while the city still slept. The abandoned chapel stood on a gentle hillside overlooking the river, its stone walls weathered by time but still dignified. Sunlight filtered through cracked stained glass as they stepped. Inside, dust covered the wooden pews, yet one section near the altar appeared strangely untouched. Ethan instinctively walked toward it, holding the restored pendant in his hand. As he approached the ancient stone floor, he noticed a shallow carving identical to the completed crest. Without thinking, he lowered the pendant into the center of the symbol. A quiet click echoed beneath the chapel. Nothing dramatic happened, but one of the floor stones shifted slightly. Damien carefully helped lift the heavy slab, revealing a narrow compartment hidden beneath it. Inside rested a sealed wooden chest wrapped in faded blue cloth. Alexander opened it with remarkable care. Instead of jewels or royal treasures, they found neatly preserved letters tied together with a silver ribbon and a leather journal bearing the signature of Elias Brooks. Ethan stared at the familiar name in disbelief. With trembling hands, he opened the journal to its first page. The handwriting was elegant and steady. The opening sentence immediately captured everyone's attention. If you are reading this, then our family survived exactly as we hoped. Ethan continued reading aloud. Elias explained that the royal family had not vanished because of defeat or betrayal. They had chosen to disappear voluntarily after realizing that endless competition for power would divide the continent forever. One branch of the family had been hidden among ordinary citizens so that future generations could live free from political ambition until the time was right for history to remember them. Ethan lowered the journal, overwhelmed by the revelation. My family gave up everything on purpose. Alexander looked at him with quiet respect. They chose peace instead of power. Damien slowly nodded. That changes everything. Just as hope began replacing uncertainty, another folded letter slipped from the back of the journal. Unlike the others, it had never been opened. Across the front was written a single name in bold handwriting. Chancellor William Hawthorne. Alexander's expression hardened with confusion. That cannot be possible, he whispered. The current Chancellor carried exactly the same name. The historian carefully broke the ancient seal and unfolded the letter. After reading only a few lines, his face lost all color. Ethan immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. What does it say? The historian looked toward Alexander before answering in a quiet voice. It says the guardian assigned to protect this secret would one day inherit the title of Chancellor, generation after generation. Alexander slowly took the letter from his hands. At the bottom of the page, beneath the ancient signature, appeared one final instruction. Trust no chancellor after the 7th generation, because when the bloodline returns, the protector will become the one who fears it most. The return to Ashford Palace was quieter than anyone expected. No one spoke during the carriage ride because every person inside understood that the greatest threat had never come from a rival kingdom. It had been sitting at the king's council table for years. As the palace gates opened, Alexander ordered the recovered journal, letters, and restored pendant to be placed inside the royal vault under his personal seal. Only Ethan, Damien, the elderly historian, and the captain of the royal guard remained aware of the complete truth. By afternoon, the Continental Summit officially began. Monarchs, ambassadors, and representatives from across the continent filled the magnificent assembly hall beneath towering stained glass windows. The atmosphere remained respectful, yet every conversation carried unmistakable tension. Ethan entered beside Alexander, drawing hundreds of curious eyes. Instead of feeling important, he felt like someone whose future had already been debated long before he had entered the room. Chancellor William Hawthorne stood at the center platform, welcoming every delegation with the same calm dignity he had displayed throughout his decades of service. His voice remained steady as he outlined the purpose of the gathering. We are here to preserve peace through cooperation. Had Ethan not discovered the ancient letter only hours earlier, he would have believed every word. Alexander remained silent throughout the opening ceremony, carefully watching the chancellor rather than the assembled rulers. Damien noticed the king's attention and quietly moved closer, speaking only loudly enough for Alexander to hear. He looks perfectly calm. Alexander answered without looking away. Sometimes the most dangerous plans are hidden behind the calmest faces. The formal discussions continued for nearly 2 hours. Representatives debated history, legal traditions, and diplomatic responsibility. Every proposal sounded reasonable. Every argument appeared balanced. Yet one recommendation slowly emerged above the others. Chancellor Hawthorne suggested that Ethan should immediately be transferred into permanent Continental Council protection, supervised by an independent committee instead of remaining under Ashford's guardianship. Several rulers nodded thoughtfully. Others requested clarification. Ethan recognized the proposal instantly. It was almost identical to the recommendation the Royal Council had presented to Alexander days earlier. Alexander finally rose from his seat. The enormous hall became silent. Before this assembly considers any proposal, he said calmly, there is evidence every ruler deserves to examine. He signaled to the royal guard, who carried the restored journal and the ancient letters into the chamber. Murmurs spread across the audience. The chancellor remained outwardly composed, though his eyes briefly settled upon the familiar handwriting. Alexander opened the journal and invited the elderly historian to explain its discovery. The historian carefully described the hidden chapel, the restored pendant, and the preserved records without accusation or exaggeration. Finally, Alexander unfolded the ancient letter addressed to the Chancellor's office. This document has been authenticated by our royal archives, he announced. It contains instructions passed from one generation of chancellors to the next. The hall remained completely silent as the historian read the final warning aloud. No one interrupted. No one questioned the authenticity. When the reading ended, every ruler turned toward William Hawthorne. The chancellor closed his eyes for only a moment before releasing a quiet breath. The letter is genuine, he admitted. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Ethan looked at him with disbelief. Then why hide the truth? Hawthorne answered with unexpected sadness rather than anger. because every generation before mine believed the same thing. If the bloodline ever returned, ambitious rulers would compete for influence again. My ancestors thought the safest solution was to make certain no heir could ever be recognized. Alexander stepped forward. But Ethan never sought power. Hawthorne slowly nodded. I know. That is what made this so difficult. The Chancellor reached into his robe and removed the official seal of his office, placing it gently upon the council table. Some traditions begin with honorable intentions, he said quietly. But when people protect a secret for too long, they eventually forget whether they are preserving peace or merely preserving control. The hall remained motionless. One by one, the assembled rulers realized the conflict had never truly been about Ethan's claim, his ancestry, or even the future of a forgotten dynasty. It had been about fear guiding decisions across generations. Ethan looked toward Alexander, whose expression carried neither triumph nor resentment. It reflected only relief that the truth no longer needed to remain hidden. At that moment, the presiding officer of the Continental Council slowly stood and announced that before any final decision could be made, every previous proposal concerning Ethan Brooks would be withdrawn and replaced with a single question that no treaty had ever prepared them to answer. If the last surviving heir wanted neither a throne nor political authority, what future should the continent choose instead? The assembly hall remained silent after the final question echoed beneath its vaulted ceiling. Kings, queens, ambassadors, and council members who had spent decades negotiating borders and alliances suddenly found themselves facing a decision that no law had anticipated. They had prepared to debate succession, authority, and influence. None of them had prepared to hear the only person at the center of the discussion quietly refuse every symbol of power they believed he should desire. Ethan slowly rose from his seat. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the realization that every word spoken next might shape generations yet to come. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of rulers from every corner of the continent before speaking in a calm voice. When I entered this palace, I believed I was an ordinary secretary. During the past week, I discovered that my family sacrificed everything so future generations could live without endless struggles over crowns. If I accepted a throne today, then their greatest hope would disappear because of me. The room remained completely still. Ethan continued. I do not reject my family's history. I honor it by making the same choice they once made. I do not want a kingdom. I want a future where no child grows up believing that their worth depends upon a title they never asked to inherit. His words carried no accusation and no demand. They simply reflected the life he had always wanted before history unexpectedly found him. The presiding officer of the Continental Council slowly nodded. Then what would you ask of every ruler gathered here today? Ethan answered without hesitation. Protect the truth instead of controlling it. Teach our history instead of hiding it. Let people remember that peace survives because ordinary people choose it every day, not because powerful families keep secrets. One by one, the assembled rulers exchanged thoughtful glances. The Queen of the Eastern Kingdom stood first. My nation will support that proposal. Moments later, the ruler of the Western Isles rose as well. So will mine. Damian Blackwood smiled quietly before stepping forward. The North came expecting negotiations over influence. Instead, we found a reminder of why leadership exists in the first place. I will gladly sign such an agreement. All eyes finally turned toward Alexander Ashford. The king looked at Ethan with unmistakable pride before addressing the chamber. Several days ago, I believed protecting one person might cost me my throne. Today I understand something greater. A throne has value only when it protects the people entrusted to it. If that purpose is forgotten, the crown becomes nothing more than polished metal. His words were met not with applause but with respectful silence, the kind reserved for truths that required no celebration because everyone recognized them immediately. Chancellor William Hawthorne stepped forward one final time carrying the seal of his office. I entered this hall believing my duty was to preserve an ancient tradition, he admitted. I leave it understanding that traditions must also possess the courage to change. He formally resigned before the assembled rulers, recommending that future chancellors be selected through public service rather than inherited expectation. The proposal passed unanimously. Before sunset, every attending nation signed a new continental charter declaring that no surviving descendant of the former royal bloodline could ever again be treated as political property or forced into leadership against personal choice. The hidden records discovered beneath St. Rowan Chapel would be preserved inside a public historical archive where every citizen could learn the complete story for themselves. Months later, Ashford Palace had returned to its familiar rhythm. Diplomats once again filled the corridors, treaties replaced rumors, and visitors arrived to study history instead of searching for forgotten heirs. Ethan accepted a new position overseeing the Royal Historical Archive, ensuring that no important truth would ever again disappear behind locked doors. Damien often visited as a trusted ally, bringing newly uncovered records from the northern libraries, while Alexander continued leading his kingdom with the same quiet wisdom that had earned the respect of neighboring rulers long before this extraordinary journey had begun. One peaceful afternoon, a group of schoolchildren toured the archive. A curious young boy paused before an old portrait of Elias Brooks and then looked toward Ethan. "Is it true that someone in this family could have become king?" Ethan smiled warmly before answering, "Perhaps. But sometimes the greatest legacy is not accepting power. Sometimes it is showing everyone that kindness, honesty, and courage can change history without wearing a crown." Outside the tall windows, the palace gardens bloomed. Beneath the afternoon sun as church bells echoed across the capital, not to celebrate a new ruler, but to welcome a future built upon trust instead of fear, proving that the strongest kingdoms are not remembered for the crowns they protected, but for the people they chose to place above them.